Hello, dear audience. I'm Alex, and today, I'm excited to share with you the heartfelt story of Elise Parker, a journey of resilience, family, and healing. In this tale, we'll explore how Elise overcomes betrayal, rebuilds broken relationships, and discovers her own strength. At its core, this story reminds us the importance of forgiving not just others but also ourselves, and the courage to believe in the possibility of change. Through Elise's experiences, we'll see how embracing imperfections and opening our hearts can create spaces of love and understanding. So, let's dive into this inspiring narrative together. The fluorescent lights of Mount Mercy Hospital buzzed faintly as Elise Parker, a 30-year-old nurse, navigated the controlled chaos of the emergency wing. Her petite frame, clad in powder blue scrubs, exuded a calm professionalism that belied the storm brewing within her. Elise was known for her empathy and steady demeanor, but today, her thoughts were elsewhere. A single notification on her phone had unraveled the careful balance she maintained. Family meeting tomorrow. Mallory will be there. The name Mallory ignited a familiar ache in Elise's chest, a tangled knot of resentment and unresolved pain. Her sister, 4 years older and always the golden child, had a knack for making Elise feel invisible. Mallory wasn't just her sister, she was a mirror of all Elise wasn't. While Elise's life revolved around quiet acts of care and diligence, Mallory was a walking spectacle. Her glamorous career as a luxury real estate agent provided her with the perfect stage to flaunt designer heels, rooftop galas, and lavish vacations. But Mallory's shine had a darker edge. Beneath the curated perfection lay a sharp competitiveness, one that Elise had endured for years. Mallory's success wasn't just personal, it was often built at the expense of others, including her own sister. The betrayal 3 years ago, when Mallory became involved with Elise's husband, Jacob, was the final fracture. Elise's marriage to Jacob had once been her haven, a partnership built on shared dreams and quiet evenings. But over time, subtle cracks had formed, his growing impatience with her long hours at the hospital, his dismissive comments about her modest lifestyle. Those cracks widened when Mallory entered the picture. Elise could still remember the night she caught them together, Jacob's hand resting on Mallory's arm in a way that was undeniably intimate. Mallory's laughter had cut through the cold air like a blade. "Elise," she had said, her tone almost pitying, "you're great at taking care of others, but Jacob deserves someone who challenges him." Jacob hadn't even tried to deny it. His words still haunted Elise, "You're a good person, Elise, but that's not enough anymore." Now, Mallory's presence loomed again, stirring memories Elise had tried to bury. But this time, she vowed not to let her sister's shadow consume her. This meeting wasn't just about family, it was a reckoning. Elise wasn't the same woman who had walked away quietly 3 years ago. She had spent those years rebuilding her life, rediscovering her strength, and learning to stand tall in her own right. As Elise moved toward the next patient's room, her chestnut brown eyes hardened with resolve. Whatever awaited her at that family meeting, she was ready to face it head-on. Mallory might have shattered her before, but Elise was no longer breakable. The Parker family home stood as it always had, a picture of suburban charm with its white picket fence, neatly trimmed hedges, and pale blue shutters. To an outsider, it was idyllic, a haven of warmth and stability. But for Elise Parker, it was a house full of ghosts. She parked her modest sedan in the driveway, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as she willed her nerves to steady. This wasn't just a family meeting. This was Mallory's stage, her chance to assert her dominance yet again. But Elise wasn't the same woman who had once shrunk under her sister's spotlight. She had spent 3 years stitching herself back together, piece by painful piece. When she stepped inside, the familiar scent of her father's pipe tobacco and lemon-scented polish greeted her. The house was unchanged, every detail meticulously preserved, as though time had stood still. Her father, Henry Parker, emerged from the kitchen with a hesitant smile. His once robust frame had withered, and his thinning gray hair made him appear older than his years. "Elise," he said warmly, though his voice carried a note of unease. "I'm glad you came." "I'm here for you, Dad," Elise replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She glanced toward the living room, where the low hum of Mallory's voice filtered through the doorway. Elise steeled herself and stepped inside. Mallory sat on the plush sofa, perfectly poised, her legs crossed elegantly beneath a tailored blazer and pencil skirt. Her blonde curls cascaded over her shoulders, and a gold necklace glinted at her throat. She looked up as Elise entered, her smile sharp and polished. "Elise," Mallory said, drawing out the name as though it were a precious gem she was examining. "It's been so long. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about us." "I've been busy," Elise replied evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. Mallory's lips curved into a faint smirk. "Still saving lives, I see. Good for you. The world needs people like you, selfless, tireless, reliable." Her tone was saccharine, with just enough edge to sting. Before Elise could respond, another voice interrupted. "Elise," Jacob said, stepping into the room. He carried a leather briefcase, his suit impeccably tailored, and his cologne as overpowering as ever. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, something flickered there, guilt, perhaps, or discomfort. "Jacob," Elise replied, her tone clipped. He gestured toward the chair across from Mallory. "Join us. We're waiting for your dad to start." Elise hesitated before sitting. The air in the room was heavy, charged with unspoken tensions. Her father entered moments later, carrying a thick folder. He set it on the coffee table with deliberate care, his movements slow but purposeful. "Thank you all for coming," Henry began, his voice wavering slightly. "I've been holding on to something for a long time, and it's time we addressed it." Mallory tilted her head, her expression curious but cautious. "What's this about, Dad?" Henry opened the folder, revealing a stack of papers. "This is about your mother," he said quietly. "And about the truth." The mention of their mother sent a pang through Elise's chest. She had been gone for 3 years, her final days marked by pain and decline. Elise had been there for every moment, holding her hand, brushing her hair, whispering words of comfort. Mallory, on the other hand, had been conspicuously absent, her excuses always tied to work or travel. Henry pulled out a financial ledger, sliding it toward Mallory. "For 3 years, I sent $5,000 every month to cover your mother's care. These records show the transfers. But when I reviewed the facility's statements after her death, I found something troubling: none of the payments were ever received." Mallory's confident posture faltered, her smile freezing in place. "That can't be right," she said, her tone sharp. "There must be a mistake." Henry's expression hardened. "There's no mistake. The money was withdrawn every month, but instead of going to the care facility, it went elsewhere: vacations, designer clothes, private dinners." He slid another document across the table. "These are the receipts." "Your receipts?" Mallory's face paled. "Dad, You took the money," Henry interrupted, his voice unyielding. "While your mother was dying, you used the funds for your own indulgence." Elise's stomach churned as she watched Mallory struggle to maintain her composure. But it wasn't just anger that Elise felt. For the first time, she saw cracks in her sister's armor, a flicker of shame in her eyes, a tremor in her voice. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," Mallory said, her voice quieter now. "I thought I'd have time to pay it back. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize the cost wouldn't just be financial," Elise cut in, her voice trembling with emotion. "She needed us, Mallory. She needed you." Mallory looked away, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, her voice laced with defensiveness. "Living up to everyone's expectations. Always being the one who has to succeed, to shine. I didn't have the luxury of being selfless like you, Elise. I had to survive in my own way." Elise blinked, taken aback by the rawness of Mallory's admission. It didn't erase the pain or justify her actions, but it added a layer of complexity to her sister's character, something Elise hadn't allowed herself to see before. Henry's gaze remained steady. "Whatever your reasons, Mallory, the damage is done. It's time to face the consequences." Jacob, who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. "Henry, let's not make this worse than it needs to be." "It's already worse than it needs to be," Henry said sharply, cutting him off. He turned to Elise, his expression softening. "You were the only one who stayed. The only one who truly honored her." The weight of his words settled over the room. For Elise, it was a bittersweet vindication. Mallory's actions had been exposed, but the scars they left couldn't be erased. Still, as she looked at her sister, no longer the untouchable figure she had always seemed, Elise felt something unexpected: pity. The living room felt heavier after Henry's revelations, as though the weight of the truth had permeated every corner of the house. Elise Parker sat quietly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together. Across from her, Mallory's once pristine composure had unraveled. Her blonde curls now framed a face marked by unease and something Elise hadn't expected: vulnerability. For years, Elise had seen her sister as untouchable, an impenetrable force of confidence and charisma. But now, sitting in their childhood home surrounded by evidence of Mallory's betrayal, Elise couldn't deny the cracks that had begun to show. She wasn't sure whether to feel anger or pity. Henry's voice broke the silence, his tone firm yet weary. "Mallory, I want you to understand something. This isn't about punishment, it's about accountability. Your mother gave everything for this family, and at the end of her life, she deserved the same from us. But instead of being there, you chose to prioritize your own comfort over her care." Mallory opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered to Jacob, who sat stiffly beside her. He avoided her gaze, his jaw clenched tightly. "Jacob," Henry said, turning his attention to the man who had once been Elise's husband. "You have your own role in this. You falsified her medical records, downplayed her condition, and left her vulnerable when she needed you most. You were supposed to be her doctor." Jacob finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "Henry, I didn't intend for it to go this far. I thought I was protecting the family, keeping things under control." "Control?" Elise interjected, her voice sharp. "You call lying to everyone and neglecting her care control? She trusted you, Jacob. We all did." Jacob's eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, Elise saw something that almost resembled regret. "I didn't know how to handle it," he admitted. "I thought if I kept things quiet, it would all work out. I was wrong." Elise wanted to believe him, to take some solace in his admission. But the years of pain he and Mallory had caused were too fresh, too raw. "You didn't just hurt her," Elise said quietly. "You hurt all of us. You hurt me." Jacob's expression faltered, and he looked away. Mallory, however, bristled. "Is this what you wanted, Elise?" she snapped, her voice tinged with bitterness. "To sit here and watch us grovel? To finally feel like you've won?" Elise blinked, startled by the accusation. "This isn't about winning, Mallory. It's about facing the truth. Something you've spent your entire life avoiding." Mallory's shoulders sagged, her defiance giving way to exhaustion. "You think it was easy for me?" she asked, her voice softer now. "You've always had Dad's quiet support, Mom's praise for being the selfless one. I had to fight for everything, every ounce of attention, every shred of approval. And when that wasn't enough, I built my own world. I didn't mean to let it fall apart like this." Henry sighed, his expression a mixture of disappointment and sadness. "Mallory, approval isn't something you take or demand. It's something you earn through love, integrity, and sacrifice." Elise understood that. Your mother understood that. It's time you learn it too. For the first time, Mallory didn't argue. She looked down at her lap, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her skirt. Henry leaned back in his chair, his frail body seeming smaller than ever. "I've made my decision," he said quietly. "The house, the savings, the inheritance, all of it will go to Elise. She's the one who honored this family, who stayed when everyone else left." Mallory looked up sharply, but her protests died in her throat. Jacob shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing against Mallory's arm in what seemed like a silent gesture of reassurance. "There's one condition," Henry continued, his voice firmer now. "Mallory, if you want any chance at redemption, you will repay the money you took. Not to me, but to charity, an organization for elderly care. And Jacob," he turned his piercing gaze toward him. "You'll come clean about your actions to the hospital board and face whatever consequences come." Jacob's face went pale, but he nodded. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elise sat in stunned silence, the weight of her father's words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had imagined moments like this before, where justice would finally be served and the years of pain would somehow be erased. But now, with the truth laid bare and her father's decision made, she felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. As Mallory rose to leave, her movements stiff and reluctant, she paused at the doorway. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes meeting Elise's. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "For everything." Elise didn't respond immediately. The apology felt fragile, like a delicate thread dangling between them. But it was something, a start. "I hope you mean it," Elise said finally, her voice steady but guarded. Mallory nodded and turned away, Jacob following closely behind her. The door closed softly behind them, leaving Elise and her father alone. Henry reached out and placed a hand over Elise's. "You deserved better," he said quietly. "I should have seen it sooner. But I'm proud of you, Elise. Your mother would have been proud too." Tears welled in Elise's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. In that moment, the weight of the past began to lift. It wasn't gone entirely, healing would take time, but for the first time, Elise felt a glimmer of peace. She looked around the room that had once felt like a battlefield and saw something new, a place where she could rebuild, not just for herself, but for the memory of the family they had once been. The house felt quieter in the days following the family meeting. Elise Parker stood in the garden, her hands brushing against the soft petals of her mother's roses. She had spent the morning trimming the overgrown bushes, the simple act grounding her after the tumultuous revelations of the past week. The sun warmed her shoulders, and the earthy scent of soil and flowers filled the air. For the first time in years, she felt a fragile sense of peace. Yet, beneath it, echoes of the confrontation lingered, Mallory's apology, Jacob's downcast eyes, and Henry's firm declaration of justice. It was a lot to process. Her father's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You've done a good job with the garden, Elise," Henry said as he shuffled onto the porch, leaning on his cane. Elise smiled faintly. "I think Mom would have wanted it to look nice." Henry nodded, his gaze drifting toward the roses. "She loved this garden. Spent hours out here, even when she wasn't feeling well." His voice grew quieter, tinged with regret. "I should have spent more time out here with her." Elise looked at him, the weight of his words settling between them. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had always been stoic. "You were doing what you thought was best," she said gently, though part of her had always resented how absent he'd seemed during her mother's final years. "I wasn't," Henry admitted, shaking his head. "I thought providing was enough. I thought keeping the house running and paying the bills was all that mattered. But your mother, she needed more than that. She needed me to show up. Just like you did." The words caught Elise off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "It wasn't easy," she said finally. "Watching her fade like that. But I couldn't leave her, Dad. Not when she needed me. Henry's eyes met hers, a deep sadness reflected in their depths. You gave her what I couldn't, Elise. And I'll always be grateful to you for that. I only wish I'd told you sooner. Elise swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to spill over. She had spent so long feeling like her efforts went unnoticed, like she was the only one who saw how much her mother had suffered. Hearing her father acknowledge it now, even years later, felt like a balm to an old wound. Later that afternoon, Elise found herself in the nursery she had begun preparing for her future child. The pale yellow walls glowed softly in the afternoon light, and the crib she had assembled with her father's help sat in the corner. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, her thoughts drifting to Mallory. She hadn't heard from her sister since the meeting. The silence was unsurprising but still heavy. Elise knew Mallory's apology had been genuine, but words alone weren't enough to mend years of betrayal. And yet, Elise couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, her sister would take the first steps toward change. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Wiping her hands on her jeans, she made her way to the front door. When she opened it, Mallory stood on the porch, her usual poise softened by an air of hesitation. She held a bouquet of daisies, simple, understated, and entirely unlike her usual flair. Elise, Mallory began, her voice tentative. Can I come in? Elise hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. Sure. They sat at the kitchen table, the bouquet resting awkwardly between them. Mallory seemed smaller than Elise remembered, her confident exterior stripped away. I've been thinking about what you said, Mallory began, her hands fidgeting in her lap. About facing the truth. You were right, I've spent my whole life avoiding it. Elise studied her sister, noting the vulnerability in her expression. What are you trying to say, Mallory? Mallory sighed, her shoulders sagging. I want to fix things. I don't know if I can, but I want to try. For once, I want to stop running and actually take responsibility. Elise's chest tightened. She had longed to hear those words for years, but now that they were spoken, she didn't know how to feel. It's not going to be easy, she said carefully. You've hurt a lot of people, Mallory. And it's going to take more than an apology to make things right. I know, Mallory said quietly. But I'm willing to do the work. I don't want to lose my family completely. For the first time, Elise saw a glimpse of the sister she had once known, the one who had danced with her in the rain as kids, who had stayed up late whispering secrets under the covers. That version of Mallory had been buried beneath layers of pride and insecurity for so long, Elise had almost forgotten she existed. You're not going to lose me, Elise said after a long pause. But you have to prove that you mean it. Actions speak louder than words, Mallory. Mallory nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I will, she promised. The conversation was far from a resolution, but it was a start, a fragile thread connecting them across years of pain. Elise didn't know if Mallory would follow through, but for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. That evening, as Elise sat on the porch with her father, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a quiet sense of possibility. Her family was fractured, its pieces scattered and bruised, but not beyond repair. She had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about finding a way to move forward despite it. Do you think she'll change? Henry asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Elise thought of the daisies on the kitchen table, of Mallory's tentative words. I think she's trying, she said. And that's more than I expected. Henry nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're a better person than I'll ever be, Elise. Elise shook her head, her gaze fixed on the fading light. I'm just trying to do what Mom would have wanted. As the stars began to emerge, Elise felt a quiet resolve settle within her. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. Her family might never be perfect, but she had learned that perfection wasn't the goal. Love, forgiveness, and the courage to rebuild, that was enough. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Parker family home, casting warm, golden light over the living room. Elise Parker stood in the center of the space, taking in the quiet serenity that had settled over the house. It felt different now, lighter, as if the years of tension and unspoken pain had finally begun to lift. She glanced at the mantelpiece, where a new photo had been placed, a picture of her mother standing in the garden, holding a vibrant bouquet of roses. Her smile was soft and genuine, the kind Elise hadn't seen often enough in those final years. Seeing it now brought a bittersweet pang to her chest, a reminder of everything they had lost and everything they were beginning to rebuild. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her reverie. Turning, she saw her father, Henry, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. Despite his frailty, he moved with a steadiness that spoke of quiet determination. "I thought you could use a break," he said, setting the tray on the coffee table. Elise smiled and sat beside him on the worn sofa. "Thanks, Dad." Henry handed her a cup, his hands trembling slightly. "You've been doing a lot around here," he said. "The house hasn't felt this alive in years." "It's been good for me," Elise admitted. "I think it's what Mom would have wanted, to see it cared for." Henry nodded, his gaze drifting to the photo on the mantelpiece. "She would have been proud of you, Elise. She always was, even if she didn't say it enough." Elise felt her throat tighten, but she managed a small smile. "That means a lot, Dad. I think I needed to hear that." The quiet moment between them was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Elise stood, smoothing her hands over her jeans, and made her way to the door. When she opened it, she found Mallory standing on the porch, a small box in her hands. "Mallory," Elise said, her voice tinged with surprise. "Hi," Mallory replied, her expression hesitant. She glanced down at the box she held. "I brought something. Can I come in?" Elise stepped aside, motioning her sister inside. Mallory followed her into the living room, where Henry offered her a nod of acknowledgement. The air in the room grew heavier as Mallory approached the coffee table and placed the box carefully on its surface. "What's this?" Elise asked, her tone cautious. Mallory took a deep breath. "It's something I've been meaning to give you for a long time." She opened the box, revealing a collection of small items, a few photographs, a handwritten note, and a delicate locket. Elise picked up the locket, her fingers brushing over its intricate design. When she opened it, she saw a tiny photo of their mother inside. "I found it when I was going through Mom's things," Mallory explained, her voice soft. "She wore it all the time when we were kids. I thought you should have it." Elise's chest tightened as she ran her thumb over the locket's smooth surface. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mallory hesitated before continuing. "I also wrote you a letter," she said, gesturing to the folded note in the box. "I didn't think I could say everything I needed to face. I've made so many mistakes, Elise, and I know I can't fix everything. But I want to try. I want to be better." Elise glanced at the note, her emotions swirling. She had spent years waiting for Mallory to acknowledge her actions, to offer more than empty apologies. Now that the moment was here, it felt overwhelming. "Thank you, Mallory," she said after a pause. "I'll read it later." Mallory nodded, her expression a mix of relief and vulnerability. "I know I've let you down more times than I can count," she said. "But I'm trying to change. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I hope we can start fresh, someday." Elise studied her sister, searching for any trace of insincerity. But all she saw was a woman who was finally confronting the consequences of her choices. "It's a start," Elise said quietly. "That's all I can ask for." Mallory's shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time in years, the distance between them felt less insurmountable. As Mallory left that afternoon, Elise sat on the porch with her father, the locket resting in her palm. The breeze carried the scent of roses from the garden, a gentle reminder of her mother's presence. "She's trying," Henry said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She is," Elise agreed, though her voice carried a note of caution. "I just hope she means it." Henry smiled faintly. "I think she does. People can surprise you, Elise, even when you think you know them completely." Elise turned the locket over in her hand, her thoughts drifting to the letter waiting inside. She wasn't ready to open it yet, but knowing it was there felt like a step forward. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elise sat in the nursery she had worked so hard to prepare. The pale yellow walls glowed softly in the fading light, and the crib stood ready for the new life she would soon welcome. She placed the locket on the windowsill, its delicate chain catching the last rays of sunlight. As she looked around the room, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years. Her family wasn't perfect, and the wounds of the past would take time to heal. But for the first time, Elise felt ready to move forward, to rebuild not just for herself, but for the life she was creating. In the quiet of the nursery, she whispered a promise to her mother's memory, to the family she was reclaiming, and to herself. "We'll be okay," she said softly. "No matter what, we'll be okay." The days passed with an air of quiet anticipation, the kind that came before something new. Elise Parker found herself balancing between the familiarity of her past and the promise of the future. The Parker family home had become a sanctuary, a place of reconciliation, healing, and cautious hope. She spent her mornings in the garden, pruning roses or planting new flowers in the spaces her mother had once lovingly tended. The afternoons were filled with preparations for the arrival of her child, a task that brought both excitement and trepidation. Each time she passed the nursery, the sight of the pale yellow walls and the crib waiting in the corner reminded her of the life she was building, one step at a time. It was on one of these quiet mornings that Elise received an unexpected message from Mallory. "Would you like to grab coffee this afternoon?" "No pressure." Elise stared at the screen for a moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. In the past, such a request would have come with strings attached, a favor to be asked, or an attempt to assert dominance. But this time, it felt different. Mallory's words were tentative, devoid of the bravado that had defined so much of her sister's life. After a moment of hesitation, Elise typed a reply. "Sure. See you at that little cafe on Main Street at 2. Mallory's response came quickly. "Perfect. Thank you, Elise." The cafe was a small, unassuming space with mismatched chairs and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. Elise arrived early, choosing a table by the window. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her nerves bubbling beneath her calm exterior. When Mallory walked in, Elise almost didn't recognize her. Her sister's usual designer heels and tailored outfits had been replaced by simple flats and a soft, cream-colored sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, and her makeup was understated, almost unnoticeable. "Hi," Mallory said with a tentative smile as she slid into the seat across from Elise. "Hi," Elise replied, her voice softer than she intended. They ordered their drinks, black coffee for Elise, a latte for Mallory, and sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "I've been seeing a therapist," Mallory said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. "I started a few weeks ago, after the meeting at Dad's house. I didn't realize how much I needed it until everything fell apart." Elise raised her eyebrows, surprised but not skeptical. "That's a big step," she said, her voice measured. Mallory nodded. "It is. And it's hard. But I'm realizing how much I've been running from things, how much of my life has been about appearances and not about who I actually am." She looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "I think I spent so long trying to prove myself that I forgot what I was even trying to prove." Elise took a sip of her coffee, letting the words sink in. This wasn't the Mallory she had grown up with, the sister who thrived on competition and control. This was someone raw, someone learning how to confront her own flaws for the first time. I appreciate you telling me, Elise said carefully. I know that can't be easy. Mallory glanced up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I don't expect us to go back to how things were, Elise. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I want you to know I'm trying. For myself, for you, for everything. For a long moment, Elise said nothing. She wanted to believe her sister, to accept the sincerity in her voice. But years of pain and betrayal weren't easily undone. It's going to take time, she said finally. But I'm willing to give it a chance. As long as you keep trying. Mallory nodded, her smile small but genuine. That's all I could ask for. The weeks that followed brought small but meaningful changes. Mallory began visiting the house more frequently, often bringing little gifts, a box of pastries from a local bakery, fresh flowers for the garden, a new book for Elise to read. She didn't overstay her welcome, nor did she try to force conversations. Instead, she simply showed up, her actions speaking louder than her words ever could. Henry, too, seemed lighter. Though his health was fragile, he found strength in the mended ties between his daughters. He spent his afternoons sitting on the porch, watching as Elise and Mallory worked side by side in the garden, or listening as they shared quiet laughter over tea in the living room. I think Mom would be proud of us, Mallory said one evening as she and Elise stood in the garden, their hands dirty from planting new rose bushes. Elise glanced at her sister, a small smile tugging at her lips. I think so too. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy and beautiful boy named Samuel, the house buzzed with life. Elise felt overwhelmed by the support that surrounded her. Mallory was there the day they brought Samuel home, her arms full of groceries and baby essentials. I know I can't make up for everything, Mallory said as she held Samuel for the first time, her voice trembling with emotion. But I hope I can be someone he can look up to. Elise watched her sister cradle her son, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and cautious hope. You're doing a good job, Mallory, she said softly. Keep going. As the weeks turned into months, the Parker family began to resemble something Elise had once thought impossible, a unit built not on perfection, but on resilience, love, and the willingness to try again. Sitting on the porch one summer evening, Samuel sleeping peacefully in her arms, Elise looked out at the garden, now blooming with vibrant life. Her father sat beside her, quietly humming a tune from her childhood. Mallory stood by the roses, carefully trimming the edges of a new bloom. For the first time in years, Elise felt whole. You did it, Mom, she whispered to the wind, her voice filled with quiet triumph. We're going to be okay. The Parker family home had changed in ways Elise Parker couldn't have imagined just months earlier. What once felt like a battleground of unresolved pain and fractured relationships had slowly transformed into a place of quiet warmth and possibility. Elise moved through the house with her infant son, Samuel, nestled in her arms, marveling at how different life felt now. In the living room, the mantelpiece was adorned with new photos, images of Samuel's first days, snapshots of Henry smiling alongside his daughters, and a picture of Elise and Mallory planting roses in the garden. These weren't just tokens of time past, they were symbols of healing, proof that even the deepest wounds could begin to mend. As Samuel cooed softly, Elise found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. It wasn't perfect, healing rarely was. There were moments when old resentments crept back in, whispers of the hurt Mallory and Jacob had caused. But the effort Mallory was making to rebuild their relationship had started to outweigh the memories of betrayal. Slowly, Elise was learning to trust again. That evening, the family gathered for a modest celebration. It was Samuel's 3-month milestone, and though Elise hadn't planned anything grand, Mallory had insisted on marking the occasion. The dining table was adorned with a simple bouquet of daisies and a small cake Mallory had brought from a local bakery. You've got quite the green thumb, Mallory said as she joined Elise in the kitchen, gesturing toward the garden visible through the window. Mom taught me everything I know, Elise replied, her voice soft. She turned to Mallory, her expression thoughtful. She would have liked seeing us out there together. Mallory nodded, her gaze distant. I think about her a lot these days. About what she'd say if she saw me now. I wasn't exactly the daughter she could be proud of back then. Elise paused, considering her words carefully. You're not that person anymore, Mallory. You're trying, and I think she'd see that. I think she'd be proud of you for it. Mallory's lips quirked into a tentative smile. Thanks, Elise. That means more than you know. As the evening wore on, the small group gathered in the living room. Henry sat in his favorite chair, Samuel resting contentedly in his lap. Mallory and Elise shared the sofa, sipping tea as they watched their father's playful cooing elicit giggles from the baby. He's going to be spoiled rotten with Grandpa around, Elise teased, her tone light. Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling. It's my prerogative as an old man. Besides, this house has been too quiet for too long. It's good to hear laughter again. Mallory leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. It's strange, isn't it? How different things feel now. I keep thinking about all the time we wasted, all the years we could have been closer if I hadn't. She trailed off, her expression tightening. Elise placed a hand on Mallory's arm, her touch gentle but firm. We can't change the past, Mallory. But we can choose what we do with the time we have now. Mallory looked at her sister, gratitude flickering in her eyes. I'm grateful for this, for a second chance. I don't deserve it, but I'm going to make the most of it. You're earning it, Elise said simply. Later that night, after the others had gone to bed, Elise found herself standing in the garden. The moonlight bathed the roses in a silvery glow, and the cool night air carried the faint scent of blooms. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, gazing up at the sky where stars glittered like tiny beacons. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, to the quiet strength she had embodied even in her final days. Elise could still hear her voice, soft but unwavering. It's not about being perfect, Elise. It's about showing up, no matter how hard it gets. A breeze rustled the leaves, and Elise closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. She thought about how much her mother would have loved Samuel, how proud she might have been to see the tentative peace forming between her daughters. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was real. And that, Elise realized, was enough. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of the porch steps. Turning, she saw Mallory standing there, her arms crossed over her chest for warmth. I thought you might be out here, Mallory said as she joined Elise by the roses. Elise smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. It's peaceful out here. Mallory nodded, her gaze scanning the garden. You've done a beautiful job with this place. Mom would have loved it. They stood in silence for a while, the weight of everything they'd been through hovering between them but no longer oppressive. Finally, Mallory spoke again. I want you to know, she said softly, that I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for Samuel too. I want him to grow up knowing he has a family he can rely on. Elise looked at her sister, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. He will, she said. Because we're going to make sure of it. For the first time in years, Elise felt a sense of true clarity. Her family wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But perfection wasn't the goal. Love, effort, and the courage to keep trying, those were the things that mattered most. As the sisters stood together in the moonlit garden, Elise felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. This was her family. Flawed, messy, and complicated, but hers. And they were moving forward, step by step, towards something better. The story of Elise Parker delivers a powerful message about resilience, forgiveness, and the strength it takes to rebuild broken relationships. In today's fast-paced, often superficial world, it reminds us of the importance of prioritizing genuine connections over appearances. It teaches that healing is a process, one that requires honesty, accountability, and the courage to confront the past. Elise's journey shows that family isn't about perfection, it's about showing up, even when it's hard, and finding ways to grow together. The story also highlights the significance of self-worth and setting boundaries to protect one's peace, even with those closest to us. Ultimately, the narrative encourages us to embrace vulnerability, to forgive not just others but also ourselves, and to believe in the possibility of change. In doing so, we can create spaces of love and understanding, even amidst the imperfections of life.